Hello and welcome back everyone, and as promised we will continue for giving you the strongest chess games in that event of Norway Chess 2024. This is the final round and it is final round. This is the classic time control, so let's see how it goes. We get pawn to e4 and now we get e5 from Magnus, knight to f3 from Firouzja and now knight to c6 from Magnus, bishop to c4 which is the Italian game, and now we get bishop to c5 from Magnus. Pawn to d3 from Firouzja to try to open this dark square bishop. We get knight to f6 from Magnus. Firouzja plays bishop to g5, pinning the knight to the queen on d8, and now we get pawn to h6 and now bishop to h4. Now this bishop on h4 is not considered to be that a great bishop. And why is that? Because in some positions black could go pawn to g5 and try to play pawn d6, queen e7 and bishop e6 and try to castle queenside, and this bishop will feel so sad on g3, but at the meantime it is a good move. So we get pawn to d6 from Magnus and now pawn to c3 from Firouzja. Firouzja is trying to play in the center with this pawn push d4. So we get pawn to a6 from Magnus to retreat this bishop back, so in case d4 comes, it does not come with the tempo attacking the bishop. So we get knight d2 from Firouzja and now bishop to a7 from Magnus. Short castle from Firouzja and now queen to e7 from Magnus. And now we get pawn to b4, a pawn expansion in the queen side to try to restrict the idea that black may want to castle queen side. So we get bishop to e6 from Magnus anyways, and now we get pawn to a4 from Firouzja. Firouzja is trying to go aggressive a little bit on the queen side to try to scare black from castling there. So Magnus decided, okay, I'll just castle short, and let's see how it goes. We get rook to b1 from Firouzja, and now bishop takes c4. Now here it is not recommended to capture back with the pawn because it makes you a double pawns, and it makes the pawn on c4 and c3 a weak pawns later on the game. For example, black here could go pawn to g5, and after bishop to g3 this bishop is completely dead and these pawns will be weak at the ending. Like for example, if rook f to e8 was played and now pawn to b5 for example from black, then this knight will rotate itself to the f4 square, and these pawns are not considered to be such a great pawns because there is no counterplay for white to compensate him from his structural weaknesses. So we get knight takes c4 from Firouzja and now queen to e6 from Magnus. We get bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, and now pawn to b5 from Firouzja. Firouzja is trying to play on the queen side. Now remember, this is not the most interesting game, but we will see the most interesting game after this game. Maybe if there is one, or there is nothing, because it is a classic time control, and if somebody wins, he immediately wins the game. But if it's a tie, they play a shorter time control another game. So let's see how it goes. We get a takes b5, rook takes b5 from Firouzja to keep up the pressure on the b7 pawn. And it's not really such a great idea to play pawn to b6 since this bishop is now killed for now and forever, because there is no diagonals. There is no diagonals for the bishop to get out from. There is a pawn on c7 and there is a pawn on b6. So after rook takes b5, we get knight to d8 defending the pawn on b7 and try to rotate this knight at the same time towards the f4 square. So we get pawn to d4 from Firouzja. Firouzja is trying to break down open the center because he's got some active knights and some active pieces. So we get c6 from Magnus. Magnus is trying to close the center here. We got rook to b1 and now e takes d4 from Magnus because you got the two, because otherwise black is going to suffer if white took on e5. Like for example, if black tries to play knight to e6, then now this pawn on e5 is going to be lost. So black here took on d4. We get c takes d4 and now knight to e6, putting pressure on the pawn on f4. We get knight to b6 to trying to block this bishop away from the pawn on d4. We get bishop takes b6, rook takes b6, putting pressure on the pawn on b7. And now we get rook to a7, defending the pawn on b7 but keeping the eye on the pawn on a4. In some cases, black may wanna sack the pawn on b7 in order to get the pawn on a4. So now we get pawn to d5 from Firouzja, c takes d5, and now rather than Firouzja taking with the pawn and allowing and giving this nice square on c5 for the knight to Magnus, he rather took with the queen and kept his pawn as a one island, and now Magnus having a weakness on d6 and a weakness on b7. So Firouzja is really in a good shape here. So you get rook takes a4 from Magnus, queen takes b7, and now knight to d4 from Magnus. Magnus trying to reach an endgame. So Firouzja said, okay, you can get an endgame. We get knight takes d4, rook takes d4, and now rook to b3 back, rook to e8, putting pressure on the pawn on e4. We get rook to e3, defending the pawn on e4 by the rook and by the queen. We get queen to g6, putting even more pressure on the pawn on e4. And now, after rook to rook e to e1, Magnus just goes pawn to d5. Now, the idea behind d5 that if white intended to take, then after rook takes e3 is not possible due to rook d1 checkmate. So you will have to take back with the pawn, and after rook to d2, there is a checkmate being threatened. So you have to play queen to b8, and after king to h7, you gotta go back to g3 to trying to defend the mate. But after this exchange, this game will be ended in a draw. So let's see how the real game went. After pawn to d5, we get e5 from Firouzja, and now queen to e6 from Magnus, blockading the pawn, and at the same time keeping the eye on the e5 and protecting the pawn on d5. So you get h3 from Firouzja, rook to c4, and now after rook to d3, rook to e4, and the game ends in a draw. Both players agrees to a draw. Now you may ask yourself why I show you this game. This game is the classical one, and that game went to more crazier one in the tiebreakers, Solon having the black pieces, and Alireza chooses to play e4. We get pawn to e5, knight to f3 from Firouzja, knight to c6, and now we get bishop to c4, pretty much the same opening after bishop to c5, pawn to d3, knight f6, bishop to g5, and pawn to h6, bishop to h4 back, pawn to d6, and now pawn to c3, pretty much the same opening is played, pawn to a6, knight b to d2, bishop to a7, and short castles, queen to e7, and now we get pawn to b4, bishop to e6 from Magnus this time, and now we get pawn to a4, we get short castles from Magnus, and now we get bishop to d5. This is the new move played by Alireza Firouzja. Now, at the meantime, you may wonder why they repeat the game, right? Like, we just drew the last one, why we repeat the same opening? And it is because the players at the highest rating is used to prepare some good opening really well. So when they got a game, they got to play what they prepared because it is the best moves according to the engines. So right now Alireza chooses to deviate from the last game with bishop to d5. So we get g5 from Magnus right now, killing this bishop away. And here Alireza sacks the knight with knight takes g5. So after knight takes g5, if you captures with black, then after bishop takes g5, here white is a little bit better. In fact, he's down a piece, but he is a little bit better because right now if black plays some lazy move like something like rook to e8 for example, then queen to f3 is going to come and there is massive pressure on this knight. You have to defend it with your king, but you know that there is something wrong when you gotta defend your pieces with your king. So after knight to g5, here Magnus chooses to take the bishop on d5, and now we get knight takes e6, queen takes h4, and if you take my knight, I will take your knight. So in fact that actually e takes d5 happens, and now f takes e6, you have to take the other knight as black, as white, but if you take it, then there is a brilliant move with bishop takes f2, and you will have to go king to h1, and after that you will get cooked with bishop to g3. Bishop to g3 is a strong move because you will have to make some dark square weaknesses around your king, and black is eventually a lot better after b takes c6. He's got this massive center and you got this weak king. So here Firouzja plays pawn to g3 to defend his pawn on f2. We get queen to h3 from Magnus, and now d takes c6. We get b takes c6 from Magnus, and now queen to e2 over defending the pawn on f2. Also at the same time, white may go pawn to d4 and put pressure on the pawn on e6. We get rook to f5 from Magnus, and now we get king to h1 because right now rook to h5 was being threatened. Rook h5 here this is not a checkmate because there is a knight to f3 defending. You may wonder why rook to f8 doesn't just win the game, because knight to h4 and this whole file is completely blocked. So after king to h1, Magnus doubles on the f-file, and now we get pawn to f3 from Firouzja to defend his pawn on f2. We get rook to g5 from Magnus, he's threatening rook takes g3 due to the pin. So we get queen to g2 from Firouzja, offering the trade of the queens, and now we get queen to f5, putting pressure on the pawn on d3. He's taking advantage that this queen moved from e2 and went away. So we get rook a to d1. The idea behind it, if you take on d3, now there is knight to e4 hitting the rook and hitting the queen at the same time, and white will win an exchange. So after rook a to d1, Magnus goes pawn to h5. He says, okay, let's continue the attacking plan. So we get knight b3 from Firouzja. Firouzja is trying to jump to a5, maybe to trying to put pressure on the pawn on c6, or support this pawn push with pawn to d4. So we get h4 from Magnus. Magnus tells him, okay, I am not saying you, let's go, let's try to checkmate you. So Firouzja says, okay, I will keep it close, I will go pawn to g4. And now we get queen to h7 back from Magnus. Magnus is of course trying to go pawn to h3. So we get queen to e2, and in fact we get pawn to h3 from Magnus. And now we get Firouzja is just getting bored after being attacked. So he says, okay, let's go pawn to d4. Now I am attacking the pawn on a6, and what will you do as Magnus? Magnus chooses, okay, I will take on d4, leaving up the e6 pawn with check and leaving up the important a6 pawn. And I'm saying important because if this pawn is lost, then the pawn on a4 becomes so much stronger. So we get c takes d4 from Firouzja, and now pawn to e5 from Magnus. He's getting his pawn and his weakness away, and now we get knight to a5 from Firouzja, putting pressure on the pawn on c6. What will you do as Magnus? Magnus chooses to take on d4 and allow him to take knight takes c6, because there is queen to f7, and right now this queen is trying to penetrate from the light squares from f3 or from f4 at the dark squares as well. So we get rook to c1 to defend the knight, and now we get rook to g6, trying to get the rook to f6 to add the pressure on the f3 pawn. And now Firouzja says, okay, I will take the pawn on a6, and with this pawn on a4, I am having a good winning chances. I have a pass pawn. So we get rook to f6 from Magnus. Magnus saying, okay, show me how you will defend the pawn on e2, on f3. So Firouzja went queen to e2, defending the pawn. And Magnus here plays an inaccurate move, which is rook takes f3. Now, the best line the engine was giving is actually, in fact, a crazy move, which is bishop to b2. Now, the idea behind it is to move this queen away from defending the pawn on f3. So, for example, if queen takes b2 is played, then after rook takes f3, black is a little bit better, but there is nothing that much after a move like rook to g1, because this rook is moving up to g3 next. You may wonder that rook f2 is hitting the queen, threatening up checkmate from queen to f3, but here there is knight to e7, sacrificing the knight. The idea behind it that after you take with the queen, now you do not have queen to f3 check, and now I will have queen to b3 check and reroute my queen back to g3, and I am all good. This is a really deep idea by the engine, but of course this is a blitz game, so Magnus did not spot it and played rook takes f3. We get rook takes f3 from Firouzja, queen takes f3 with check, queen takes f3, rook takes f3, and you may wonder that this game is a draw, but we all know there is someone who is wizard here, but we don't know him yet. Let's see who will be. Will it be Magnus? Will it be Firouzja? So we get knight takes d4 from Firouzja, trading off the pieces, pawn e takes d4, and now we get rook to a1. Now you may wonder why he didn't take the pawn on c7, because if he takes the pawn on c7, then rook f1 is checkmate in one move. So he went rook to a1 to support his pawn on running down from the a file. But in fact, rook to a1 is a big blunder, and you will see now why. It is a big blunder because Magnus here could have played pawn to d3, and in fact Magnus is winning, because this pawn is so quick. If Firouzja tries to push the pawn, then Magnus will push his pawn, and after something like pawn to a6, then here we will get rook to e3. The king cannot run from the first rank, and rook to e1 check is deadly and coming up next move no matter what you do as white. So hence why it is a losing move. But Magnus did not spot the idea and played rook to b3, even a big blunder again, because right now a5 just draws the game. But will it be a draw or not? We will just see in seconds. We get rook takes to b4, and now pawn to a6 from Firouzja. We get rook to b8 to try to blockade this pawn. We get pawn to a7, rook to a8, and now king to g1 from Firouzja. Pawn to c5 from Magnus to ensure that his pawns are connected. Now here Magnus is up a pawn, but his pawn on h3 seems a little bit sketchy with king to f2, king to g3, and trying to win the pawn. So we get king to f2, king to f7, king to e2. Alireza plays. The idea behind it that he does not want to go king to g3 because it allows c4 and allows these pawns to run. So he went king to e2 to try to prevent Magnus from pushing his pawns. Magnus goes c4 anyways, and now we get rook to a5. From Firouzja is trying to play rook to d5 and win either the pawn on d6 or the pawn on d4. We get pawn to d3 with check, and now we get king to d2, and this position is a draw. But will it be a draw or not? We will find out. We get king to g6, and now king to c3 from Firouzja. We get pawn to d5 from Magnus. The idea behind it that if you take the pawn on d5, I will take the pawn on a7 and just call it a draw. But Alireza said he thought that he is winning here because his king is getting in and he's winning this pawn on d5, right? Like for example, a sample line for an easy draw is rook takes d5, rook takes a2, and now king takes c4. This pawn is being watched out, and after something like rook to a2 to try to win this pawn, king takes d3, take the pawn on d2, we will get king to e3, and this king is too close to catch up the pawn on h3. But here Alireza did not spot the idea and in fact played the losing blunder and the end of the game, which is rook to a2. Rook to a2 is a massive blunder because there is king to g5, and immediately here Magnus Carlsen just won the game. Because right now the pawn on g4 is lost, and if you try to get your king to defend the pawn and try to promote this pawn, these pawns will be so much stronger and so much faster. Like for example, if you get your king to c5, then there is going to be pawn to c3, and if you take the pawn on d5, there is pawn to c2 trying to queen. You will prevent it, then d2, then these pawns are just so much stronger than this rook or this pawn, and Magnus made his wizardry again and won the game. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure to check the previous rounds that we uploaded on the channel and stay tuned for the next tournaments. Goodbye.